as we continue to worship the Lord, as we continue to prepare our hearts to receive God's message to us this morning. Let's go to God together in a word of prayer. Let's pray. O Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts together be pleasing in your sight. Lord, you are our rock, and you are our Redeemer. And all of God's people together said, Amen. Amen. Question for you this morning. Is anyone here forgetful? Whoa, that is a lot of hands going up. Whose hand was up over here? I saw a couple hands. Carol, what's something you forget sometimes? Do you have an example? I know I'm putting you on the spot. That is, in case you didn't hear her, she said, I don't remember. Which is the best possible answer you can give to that question. That's so wonderful. I think we can stop now. It's great. It's a pretty common experience, right, to forget things. So I've always been a little bit of a forgetful person, but I've always thought about myself that I'm not forgetful, right? Like I've always been the kind of person who's like, well, if you tell me something, like I'll remember. I will, I'll remember. I mean, if you said this, like, oh, of course, I'll remember, right? And I don't write it down. I don't make a note anywhere. I'll say, I'll remember. And in various times in my life, that has come back to haunt me a little bit. But one of the moments that it shifted for me, and one of the ways I realized this about myself was in college. I was very involved in our theater program in college. I loved to be in shows and plays. So during one of the first productions that I was a part of, we were doing blocking. So blocking is what you do, like kind of at the beginning of the show. It means kind of where the characters are moving on the stage and when, and it's got to be all coordinated, right? So you're working on this blocking, your director's telling you where to go. So our director, she's telling us all these different things, and I'm just kind of looking at my script and not writing anything down. And I'm going, yeah, no, I'll remember this, that's fine. And I remember her kind of calling me out and saying, Marcus, are you writing down your blocking? And I was like, yeah, no, I'm good. I'm good, Jared. I'll remember, no problem. And she stopped and she said, Marcus, you write it down. And she said, you want to know a theater trick? She said, amateurs say they'll remember, professionals write it down. Right? And I was like, how would I be a professional if I wrote it down? Forgetfulness. We all live with it, right? We forget big things, we forget little things, we forget all sorts of different stuff. It falls through the cracks of our lives. Now, why am I asking you about this before today's message? So, we've been going through these Old Testament feasts and festivals. You see all the different things on display that we've been talking about. Today, we're talking about something called the Feast of Trumpets. Okay? It's a little bit of a strange one, the Feast of Trumpets. If you'd like to, you can open your Bibles and turn to Leviticus chapter 23. This has been our kind of guiding passage all throughout Lent. Leviticus 23, you can see from the headings here in this chapter that these are all the different feasts and festivals that we've been talking about. We talked about Sabbath, we talked about Passover and unleavened bread, we talked about first fruits. Last week we talked about the Feast of Weeks. Today we get to, in verse 23, the Feast of Trumpets. It's just a couple of short verses that we're going to read today. So this is Leviticus 23, verses 23 through 25. The Lord said to Moses, say to the Israelites, on the first day of the 7th month, you are to have a day of rest. A day of sacred assembly commemorated with trumpet blasts. Do no regular work, but present an offering made to the Lord by fire. People of God, this is the word of the Lord. It's not the most informative passage, is it? It doesn't really give us a lot of information about this feast. We get a day for it, first day of the 7th month. The Israelites are told to have a day of Sabbath rest and a sacred assembly commemorated with trumpet blasts. Whatever that means, right? They were to do no regular work, and they were to bring a food offering to the Lord. That's the extent of the information that we get in these verses about the Feast of Trumpets. So, one of the best ways to kind of understand what's going on here is to look at what this feast eventually became. We might not know much about how it was observed in Leviticus time, but eventually this feast grew into the Jewish New Year celebration, also known as Rosh Hashanah. Okay, who's ever heard of Rosh Hashanah before? Okay, it's the Jewish New Year. The Feast of Trumpets eventually became Rosh Hashanah. And so like we discovered before, we've been looking at this the last couple of weeks, right? This is the Jewish calendar and where these different feasts fall in, okay? So on the blue circle here, this is our regular calendar. Hopefully that looks familiar to you, okay? Out here we have the Jewish months, the Jewish calendar. So their New Year is right here. September, October, somewhere in there, they celebrate the Feast of Trumpets, which is their New Year's Day. And then that leads into the Feast of Atonement, the Feast of Tabernacles. We're going to be talking about those next week, and then on Maundy Thursday, we're going to talk about those two days and those two times. So, this is the Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah. So, I'm going to ask you the same question that I did last week, if you were here with us. I asked you last week, what do you think the mood of this feast or festival was? Jewish New Year, what do you think the mood was of this particular day? Festive, celebratory, somber, solemn, what do you think? I set you up. It wasn't a celebratory day. I know, I'm sorry, that was a leading question. I apologize. But when we think of New Year's, right, we think celebration, we think, great, this is going to be wonderful, it's a party. But this day, this feast is actually a very solemn day. It's a day for introspection. It's a day it's a call to reflection and a call to recommit your life to God. It's also the beginning, it marks the beginning of a 10-day period leading up to the Day of Atonement. Okay, the Day of Atonement is one of the most significant and important days in the Jewish calendar where they remember the forgiveness of their sins. And we're going to talk about that on Maundy Thursday. But if you need a place to keep the Feast of Trumpets in your mind, remember last week when we talked about the Feast of Weeks with this little guy? It was essentially like Thanksgiving, right? So it was a time of harvest, it was a time of giving thanks. If you need a place to put this feast in your brain, you can put it next to Ash Wednesday. Okay? So Ash Wednesday is kind of the first day of Lent, right? It begins a time of self-reflection and introspection leading up to the day and the time when we remember our forgiveness of sins. Okay? Now they're not exactly the same. Okay? Ash Wednesday and Feast of Trumpets aren't exactly the same. But if you need a place to keep it, that's kind of where you can put it in your brain. So, Feast of Trumpets. It's a day, we're told, that is commemorated with blasts of trumpets. So, trumpets. What kind of trumpets did they have? They weren't like the ones we have today, right? That you play in school band and have the 3 valves and shiny and curved and all that different stuff. Most of the trumpets that they used in the Old Testament were made of ram's horns. So they would take the horn of a ram, they would hollow it out, and they would make it into an instrument called a shofar. So, today I have an actual shofar here. Okay, so this is a small little guy. They make shofars and ram's horns. I mean, you can find some that are like this big, right? These big kind of curvy things. And if you look at this closer, you can come up and look at this later if you want to. This is essentially a mouthpiece, right? It looks just kind of like a trumpet mouthpiece, and this would be the kind of trumpet that they would use. They would blast this as a trumpet. They would use it as a ram's horn. Now, the sound of a shofar is not the most beautiful sound in the world. I am also not a professional trumpet player or shofar player, so I'm going to give it my best shot so you can kind of hear what this sounds like. I've been practicing, but I make no promises, okay? So this is what a shofar sounds like. Beautiful, right? Yeah. You can tell I've been practicing, okay? That's a shofar. Not the most beautiful noise in the world, is it? Oh, let's hear it one more time. That was better. I'm getting better at this. If you go by church sometime during the week and you hear that, that's just me practicing. The Feast of Trumpets. Commemorate the day with blasts of trumpets. And we don't know exactly how many they would have done in the time of Leviticus, but we know today, so Rosh Hashanah today, still it is traditional for the shofar to be sounded 100 times throughout the day. Okay? That's a lot of times to listen to that noise, right? 100 times throughout the day. One interesting thing to note also, this is a little bit of an aside, but the shofar is the same kind of trumpet that Joshua would have used to take down the walls of Jericho. Okay? Do you remember that story? Where Joshua and the people marched around the city, and on the seventh day they marched around 7 times, and then 7 priests blew the trumpets, and all the people shouted. Imagine 7 of these guys going at once, and a whole army shouting. I'm sure it made quite a racket. But that's an aside. Shofars show up all sorts of different places in the Old Testament. But, Festival of Trumpets, Feast of Trumpets. God commands the Israelites on this day to sound the trumpet, to observe a day of Sabbath rest. Other translations say a day of solemn rest, commemorated with the blasting of trumpets. Now the question I think we all have is, why the trumpet? Why on earth would they blow this trumpet 100 times a day? The purpose of this festival is for people to reflect and have some time of introspection and recommit their lives to God. Wouldn't it be a little distracting to have these horns blowing 100 times throughout the day? Why the trumpet? For me, the answer lies in the very nature of these feasts and festivals themselves. If you've noticed over the last number of weeks, these feasts and festivals are very physical celebrations. So there's always a deeper meaning behind them. God is always commanding them to observe these feasts and festivals. But when He does, He doesn't just say, hey, remember that time when I brought you out of Egypt, right? With the Passover and Feast of Unleavened Bread. God doesn't just say to them, hey, remember and think about that one time that I did that one thing. Right? He gives them tangible things to do. He says, spread the blood on your doorposts. Bring this sacrifice. Bring this offering. It's a physical, tangible reminder of what I have done for you. On the Sabbath, light these candles. Bring these offerings at different points. All of these things have very physical, tactile things associated with them, so that the Israelites will remember what God has done and remember who God is. This is something I think we don't do a very good job of today. Right? We don't have a lot of tangible things that we do to remind ourselves of who God is and what God has done. We have some, right? We have the sacraments, we have the Lord's Supper, we have baptism, but generally we are a people who live our faith right up here, right? And we live it right here between our ears. But faith for the Israelites was different. So in this case, the Feast of Trumpets, these tangible trumpet blasts reminded them to return their lives to God, to focus their thoughts on God. Every time they would hear a trumpet blast, they would think to themselves, God is here. They would hear it as a call to return their lives to God, to turn their hearts away from whatever other path that might be walking on, and to turn their lives to God. The trumpet blasts are a tangible reminder that God is here. A tangible reminder that God's presence has not left them. The trumpet blasts are essentially a tap on the shoulder, right? To remind the Israelites in the midst of their day, God is here. There are 100 taps on the shoulder throughout the day saying, God is here, God is here, God is here. As humans, we are forgetful, aren't we? Now it's coming full circle. Now you're seeing it. We sometimes need a tap on the shoulder, don't we? We sometimes need reminders that God is here, and that's what the trumpet blasts do for the Israelites. It reminds them that God is here. It reminds them of the faithful deeds of God. And I think this is such a powerful feast. I think it's so beautiful. Think about this. What if I followed you around all day? Okay, I picked somebody, I went to your house, I went to your work, I went to your school, wherever you're going, and 100 times throughout the day, I blew this horn at you. Okay? You all would love me by the end of the day, right? Make myself very popular. But every time you heard that sound, What if you thought to yourself, God is here? Wherever you were, whatever you were doing, anytime you heard that noise, you thought to yourself, God is here. Return to God. What sort of day do you think that would be? Would that be a good day? In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. You'd be sick of Marcus, right? Blowing his horn at you. And I wouldn't even need to follow you around. We talked about this at Praise Team on Thursday night. What if you set the alarm on your phone to ring 100 times throughout the day? And every time your phone alarm dinged or beeped or whatever it does, every single time you said this simple prayer, God, you are here. And I give my life to you. What kind of day would that be? Wouldn't that be phenomenal? It's such a beautiful, tangible reminder that God is here. I think so often in our lives, we go about our days, we go about our regular tasks, and we forget about the presence of God. We forget that everywhere we go and everything that we do, God is there. We kind of operate under this assumption that we're on our own, right? That we can come to God sometimes, prayer time, devotion time, church, that's when I'll go to God. And the rest of the time, I'll live my life over here. We kind of just assume that we're on our own, that God shows up when we ask Him to. But that's not the way that reality is. I shared a quote in our weekly email this week that I want to share with you here. It's from a seminary professor at Western Seminary where I went to school. He wasn't a teacher of mine, but he teaches there now, and I've gotten to know him a little bit over the years. He posted this quote. I love it. God really showed up, people say. Who of us here has ever said that, right? I've said that. God really showed up, people say. No. God was always there. It was you who needed to show up. God is not a genie that requires an incantation to make an appearance. God is infinitely and always available as self-giving love. The question for us is, can we see? It's a good question, isn't it? The question for us is, can we see? Can you see that every single moment of your life is soaked in the reality of the presence of God? That everywhere you go is holy. That everything you do is done in the presence of the Lord. That's what the Feast of Trumpets is about. It's about this call and this reminder to remember that God is there, to remember that God is with you. And if you're anything like me, you probably find this whole idea and this quote, I find this to be two things. I find it to be comforting, and I find it to be convicting. Maybe you're having this same experience right now, right? This is comforting. The fact that we live our lives in the presence of God, what a comfort and what a joy that we aren't left out on an island somewhere. That God doesn't just leave us to our own devices and say, well, hope you can take care of yourself. Hope you can figure it out. You're going to have a lot of ups and downs in your life, but you'll probably be just fine. Right? He doesn't kind of leave us out. God never leaves us. God never forsakes us. God always offers His love and His grace and His presence to us every single moment of every single day. And that is absolutely a comfort. It's a comforting thing. It's a good thing. But this reminder that God is always with us, it's also a little convicting, isn't it? Again, I think every single one of us has had times in our lives where we think, boy, maybe it was okay if God wasn't there for this one. Maybe it's all right if I was on my own for this one. When we speak that word of anger, that word of hatred, when we click on that website that we probably really shouldn't be clicking on, when we gossip to a friend, when we silently or not so silently judge the lives and choices of those people around us. The list can go on and on and on. There are plenty of times in our lives when we think, well, you know what? God, if you're not here for this one, that'll be just fine. If you missed this, that will be all right. But the trumpet still sounds. God never leaves us. God never forsakes us. God's presence still abides with us. In the good, in the bad, in the ugly parts of our lives, God is here. This is what the Feast of Trumpets is about. This reminder that we live our lives in the presence of God, and this feast is both comforting and convicting for us. So as we close our message time here together, I want to do a couple of things. I want to first invite the praise team to come up. We're going to be singing a couple songs in a few minutes. But I want to invite us as a congregation now into a time of remembering God's presence. Okay? I decided against just playing the shofar for you over and over again. Okay? We're gonna do this in a different way. But I want us to simply sit with the reality that God is here. That's a simple prayer that you can pray. Honestly, this is a prayer that I have been praying over the last couple of months. Just a simple prayer to say, God, you are here. That's all I want you to do in this time. I want you to soak in the reality that God is here. Not just the idea of God or the theology of God, the living God, the true risen Christ is here with us right now at this very moment. So in this time of realizing this, I don't know what you're going to be experiencing. Maybe you will be comforted by this. Maybe you're going through a difficult time. Maybe you need God to be near to you as your friend and as your Savior. Maybe you'll be convicted by this. Maybe there's a sin lurking in your hearts that maybe you hoped God wouldn't see, but now is being laid bare in the light of God's presence. Maybe if you're like me, you're going to be both. You're going to be both comforted and convicted in this time. What I want you to do is we're going to simply have a minute or two of silence. And all I want you to do during that time is to just soak in the presence of God. Simply pray this prayer, God, you are here. And if you're feeling convicted to confess your sin, confess your sin. If you're feeling comforted by God's presence, pray that to God. Pray a prayer of thankfulness. But just let's take a minute or so of silence and just soak in the reality of God. After that, we're going to be leading a couple of songs. During that time, you are invited to sing along with us. You are invited to simply listen and reflect. You're invited to pray. You're invited to kind of worship, engage with God however you would like to over these next number of minutes. But all I invite you to do, friends, is to soak in the reality and the truth that God is here. Amen? Let's pray together.